November 14, 1967, the sky above the Drang Valley in South Vietnam turned black with smoke as Captain Ed Freeman checked his fuel gauge one more time. Below him, 400 men from the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, were trapped in a killing zone so dense with enemy fire that every helicopter pilot in the region had declared the landing zone too hot to enter. The North Vietnamese Army had surrounded the American position with an estimated 2,000 soldiers, and the wounded were dying faster than the medics could count them. Freeman had already been told no. Command had already deemed the mission suicide. Every other pilot had already turned back. But as he listened to the desperate radio calls from the ground, describing men bleeding out in the elephant grass, he made a decision that would define not just his life, but the lives of every soul trapped in that hell below. He pushed the throttle forward and descended into the maelstrom. The Battle of Drang had begun 3 days earlier, on November 11th, when Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore led his battalion into what would become the first major engagement between American and North Vietnamese forces. According to military records preserved in the National Archives and referenced in numerous accounts, including those published in Military History magazine, the Americans had walked directly into a massive enemy stronghold. Moore's men, many of them fresh from training, suddenly found themselves in the fight of their lives. Freeman was not supposed to be there. He was 43 years old, ancient by helicopter pilot standards, and he flew supply missions, not combat assaults. He had served in World War II as a Navy sailor, then joined the Army during the Korean conflict, and now found himself in yet another war. His helicopter, UH-1 Iroquois, nicknamed Huey, was designed to carry supplies and wounded, not to fly into active combat zones, where every square foot of air seemed filled with bullets and rocket-propelled grenades. But Freeman had seen enough war to know what happened when men were abandoned. He had heard the stories from Korea, the tales of soldiers left behind because the mission was deemed too dangerous. He had promised himself he would never let that happen on his watch. As his crew chief, a 20-year-old specialist from Oklahoma, gripped his machine gun and whispered a prayer, Freeman keyed his radio. "This is Huey 714. I'm going in." The voice that responded from the ground was Lieutenant Colonel Moore himself, and the strain in his tone cut through the static like a knife. They had 30 critically wounded men who would die within the hour without evacuation. They needed ammunition desperately. They needed water. They needed medical supplies. They needed everything. Freeman knew the North Vietnamese controlled the tree lines on 3 sides of the landing zone. He knew they had already shot down 1 helicopter that morning. He knew that flying in meant flying through a wall of fire with no guarantee of flying out again. His hands tightened on the controls as tracer rounds began arcing up toward him like deadly fireflies. What he did not know was that he was about to make history. The first burst of gunfire hit Freeman's helicopter before he even reached the landing zone perimeter, punching holes through the thin aluminum skin of the fuselage like it was paper. His crew chief returned fire with the mounted machine gun, the sound deafening inside the cramped cabin as Freeman pushed the Huey lower, using every trick he had learned in 2 decades of flying to make himself a harder target. The landing zone, designated X-ray, was nothing more than a small clearing, barely large enough for 1 helicopter, surrounded by wounded men crawling toward any hope of salvation. Freeman had no illusions about what he was attempting. The standard procedure for hot landing zones required gunship support, smoke screens, and multiple aircraft flying in formation to divide enemy attention. He had none of these advantages. He had only his skill, his courage, and a determination that bordered on madness. As he flared the helicopter for landing, A rocket-propelled grenade screamed past his canopy close enough that he could feel the heat through the glass. The moment his skids touched earth, wounded men began dragging themselves and their comrades toward the helicopter. Some had been shot multiple times. Others had sustained shrapnel wounds that exposed bone and organ tissue. Freeman's crew chief and door gunner jumped out to help load the wounded, working with desperate speed as bullets kicked up dirt around their feet. Freeman kept the rotors turning, ready to pull pitch and climb out the instant they were loaded, his eyes scanning the tree line where muzzle flashes winked like malevolent stars. According to accounts later published in We Were Soldiers Once and Young by Harold Moore and Joseph Galloway, a comprehensive history of the battle, Freeman's arrival brought something more precious than medical evacuation to the surrounded troops. It brought hope. The men in that landing zone had begun to believe they had been written off, that command had decided their lives were worth less than the risk of losing more aircraft. Freeman's appearance shattered that despair. He lifted off with 6 critically wounded men crammed into a space designed for 3 stretchers. The helicopter, overloaded and struggling in the thin mountain air, barely cleared the trees as Freeman coaxed every ounce of performance from the screaming engine. Tracers followed him up, stitching patterns of death through the Konzen he had occupied seconds before. His crew chief called out hits, counting the bullet holes in the fuselage, but none had struck anything vital. Not yet. Freeman flew the wounded to a field hospital 3 miles away, where surgeons worked in blood-soaked fatigues under canvas tents. He did not wait for debriefing or damage assessment. While mechanics examined his bullet-riddled helicopter, Freeman grabbed ammunition crates, water containers, and medical supplies. Other pilots, grounded by their commanders or by their own assessment of the impossible odds, watched in disbelief as Freeman prepared to return to landing zone X-ray. His commanding officer pulled him aside. "Ed, you can't go back in there. It's suicide. We've already lost 1 bird, and you got lucky once. Don't push it." Freeman looked at his commander, then looked at the supplies stacked beside his helicopter. He thought of the men still trapped in that clearing, the wounded who would die without evacuation, the soldiers running out of ammunition as thousands of enemy troops prepared for another assault. He thought of promises made to himself in other wars, on other battlefields, about never leaving men behind. "Sir, they need these supplies more than I need to stay alive," Freeman said quietly. "I'm going back." The decision stunned everyone present. Military protocol demanded obedience to direct orders, and his commander had effectively told him to stand down. But Freeman was old enough, experienced enough, and frankly too angry at the situation to accept that answer. He was going back, with or without permission, because men were dying and he had the means to save them. As he climbed back into his helicopter, his crew chief, who had every right to refuse to join him on a second suicide run, climbed in behind him without hesitation. Freeman lifted off into the afternoon sky, turning back toward the sound of distant thunder that was not thunder at all, but the continuous roar of battle. This time, he knew exactly what waited for him. This time, he knew the North Vietnamese gunners would be tracking his approach. This time, there would be no element of surprise. He went anyway, because that was what heroes did, even when they refused to call themselves heroes. The North Vietnamese had learned from Freeman's first landing. As he approached landing zone X-ray for the second time, the volume of fire directed at his helicopter doubled, then tripled. They had positioned machine gun crews specifically to cover the landing zone, understanding that the Americans would attempt more evacuations. What they had not anticipated was that the same pilot would return, flying the same aircraft, along the same flight path, giving them every advantage. Freeman altered his approach angle, coming in low from a different direction, using a ridgeline for cover until the last possible moment. His door gunner leaned out into the wind, scanning for threats, while his crew chief prepared to push out supply crates the instant they touched down. The helicopter bucked and shuddered as Freeman threw it into violent evasive maneuvers, climbing and diving in unpredictable patterns that made his crew grab for handholds and made his own stomach protest the punishment. The soldiers on the ground heard him coming before they saw him. The distinctive hump 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 of Huey rotors became the most beautiful sound imaginable to men who had been fighting for 3 days with dwindling supplies and mounting casualties. Lieutenant Colonel Moore's command post was a shallow depression in the earth, where radiomen coordinated artillery strikes and officers tried to maintain defensive positions against overwhelming numbers. When Moore heard Freeman's helicopter, he grabbed the radio himself. Huey 7-1, for the landing zone is hot. Repeat, landing zone is hot. We have heavy machine gun fire from the north and west tree lines. Freeman's response crackled through static and gunfire. Understood. X-ray coming in anyway. Mark your position with smoke. A purple smoke grenade burst in the center of the landing zone, its distinctive colored cloud drifting in the afternoon heat. Freeman used it as his aiming point, descending through a curtain of tracer fire that seemed solid enough to walk on. A bullet shattered his side window, spraying glass across the cockpit. Another punched through his seat, missing his spine by inches. His instruments flickered as electrical systems took damage. Still, he came on, committed to the landing, knowing that pulling up now would only extend his time in the kill zone. The skids hit hard, bouncing once before settling. His crew exploded into action, shoving out crates of ammunition and medical supplies, while soldiers rushed forward to grab them. More wounded were brought to the helicopter, some carried by comrades, others dragging themselves across the blood-soaked earth. Freeman counted them loading, his hand on the throttle, his feet dancing on the rudder pedals to keep the helicopter aligned. 4 wounded, 5, 6. His crew chief waved frantically, signaling the cabin was full, but Freeman saw another soldier crawling toward them, leaving a trail of blood. Determination etched on a face barely old enough to shave. Freeman held position, rotors screaming, while his door gunner jumped out and physically carried the young man aboard. The instant the gunner was back inside, Freeman pulled collective, and the overloaded helicopter clawed for altitude. Military records indicate that Freeman made not 2 but eventually 14 flights into landing zone X-ray that day and the next, though accounts vary on the exact number. What is not disputed, according to documentation from the United States Army Center of Military History, is that he refused direct orders to cease operations, citing his belief that following such orders would result in American deaths that he could prevent. On his third run, Freeman carried only ammunition. The soldiers on the ground were firing so continuously that barrels on their M16 rifles were overheating. Some had resorted to collecting ammunition from the dead, both American and North Vietnamese. Freeman landed in a maelstrom of fire so intense that his crew chief was hit in the leg by shrapnel but continued working, loading supplies and wounded while blood soaked through his flight suit. On his fourth run, a rocket-propelled grenade detonated close enough to flip the helicopter nearly on its side. Freeman fought the controls, somehow keeping the aircraft from rolling inverted, somehow managing to complete the landing even as his instruments showed catastrophic damage to hydraulic systems. He delivered more medical supplies, took on more wounded, and coaxed his crippled helicopter back to the field hospital. Mechanics declared the aircraft unflyable, Freeman found another helicopter and returned to the battle. His original crew, wounded and exhausted, insisted on accompanying him. They had started this mission together. They argued, and they would finish it together. Freeman did not have time to argue with them or to acknowledge the extraordinary loyalty they demonstrated. He simply nodded, and they climbed aboard the replacement aircraft. As the sun began to set on November 14, 1967, Freeman had already made 8 runs into landing zone X-ray. He had evacuated dozens of wounded and delivered tons of critical supplies. He had been shot at thousands of times, had taken hundreds of hits to his aircraft, and had survived circumstances that should have killed him multiple times over. Any reasonable person would have called it enough. But Freeman looked at the casualty reports, heard the radio calls describing men still dying in that cursed clearing, and knew his work was not finished. As darkness began to fall, making flight even more dangerous, he prepared for another run into the Valley of Death. The men on the ground, hearing his approach through the gathering darkness, began to believe in miracles. Night transformed Landing Zone Tenray into something from humanity's darkest nightmares. The North Vietnamese, masters of nocturnal warfare, used the darkness to probe American positions, sending small units to test defenses and search for weaknesses. Flares hung in the sky like artificial moons, casting shadows that moved and deceived, turning every bush into a potential enemy soldier. Freeman knew that flying at night, even without enemy fire, was dangerous enough to ground most helicopter operations. Flying into a hot landing zone in darkness was considered beyond reckless. He went anyway, because the wounded could not wait until morning. Many would not survive until dawn without immediate evacuation. Freeman's decision to continue operations after dark represented either the highest form of courage or the most extreme manifestation of duty, depending on who was asked. To the men bleeding in the elephant grass, the distinction was meaningless. They heard his helicopter coming through the darkness and wept with relief. Freeman's night approaches required a completely different technique. He could not rely on visual references to judge altitude and distance. The landing zone was marked only by dim flashlights that soldiers could barely hold steady, with hands shaking from exhaustion and fear. Enemy gunners had difficulty tracking him in darkness, but Freeman had equal difficulty avoiding obstacles. He flew by instinct and experience, feeling his way through the air, trusting instruments that had already taken battle damage, accepting risk that no training manual would ever condone. On his 9th run, Freeman arrived to find the landing zone under active assault. North Vietnamese soldiers had penetrated the American perimeter and were fighting hand-to-hand with defenders barely 20 yards from where he needed to land. His crew chief and door gunner opened fire with their machine guns, providing suppressive fire while Freeman held a hover, rotors beating the air just feet above soldiers locked in desperate combat. He could not land without crushing friendly forces, but he could not leave without delivering the ammunition they desperately needed. Freeman made a decision that would become legendary among helicopter pilots. He held a hover at 15 feet, high enough to clear the fighting men but low enough for his crew to push out ammunition crates. The crates tumbled down, breaking open when they hit the ground, scattering magazines of ammunition across the landing zone. American soldiers broke off from hand-to-hand combat long enough to grab fresh magazines, reload, and resume fighting with renewed intensity. Freeman, his helicopter hanging in space like a defiant middle finger to physics and enemy fire, waited until every crate was delivered before pulling up into the darkness. According to journalist Joseph Galloway, who was present during the battle and later co-authored the definitive account, Freeman's actions that night went beyond military valor into something approaching the supernatural. Galloway, then a young reporter for United Press International, witnessed Freeman's landings firsthand, and later wrote extensively about the pilot's extraordinary performance under fire. Freeman's 10th and 11th runs focused purely on evacuating the most critically wounded. Medical staff at the field hospital had established triage procedures, prioritizing patients based on severity of injury and likelihood of survival. Men who would die without immediate surgery were loaded onto Freeman's helicopter first. Men who might survive until morning were left behind. A brutal calculus that war imposed on caregivers and commanders alike. Freeman never questioned the decisions about who to take and who to leave. He simply ensured that those chosen for evacuation actually survived the flight out. One of the wounded Freeman evacuated during his 11th run was a young private from Tennessee who had taken a bullet through both lungs. The soldier was drowning in his own blood, gasping for air that would not come, his skin turning blue from oxygen deprivation. Freeman's crew chief, himself wounded and exhausted, performed emergency first aid during the flight, holding a chest seal in place with one hand while firing his weapon with the other as enemy tracers followed them through the night sky. The private survived, though he would spend a year recovering in military hospitals. 40 years later, he would attend Freeman's funeral and tell anyone who would listen that he owed every day of his life to a pilot who refused to quit. By midnight on November 14th, transitioning into November 15th, Freeman had been flying combat missions for nearly 14 hours straight. He had consumed nothing but water and coffee. He had not slept. His body ached from hours of holding his helicopter steady against wind, enemy fire, and the weight of wounded men. His hands cramped on the controls, his eyes burned from staring into darkness, searching for threats that could kill him before he even saw them. Every rational voice in his head screamed at him to stop, to rest, to let someone else take over. But there was no one else. Every other pilot had already declared the mission too dangerous. Freeman was alone in his willingness to trade his life for the possibility of saving others. So he kept flying, kept landing, kept evacuating the wounded and delivering supplies, kept defying odds that grew worse with each passing hour. His crew stayed with him, equally exhausted, equally determined, equally convinced that stopping meant men would die who could otherwise be saved. As Freeman climbed away from his 12th landing, his fuel gauge dropping toward empty, a new crisis emerged. Radio intercepts indicated that the North Vietnamese were preparing a major assault at dawn, intending to overrun landing zone Tenray in a single overwhelming attack. Lieutenant Colonel Moore's battalion needed reinforcements immediately. But the landing zone could not accommodate the large helicopters required to bring in fresh troops. The only solution was to evacuate more wounded, creating space for reinforcements to land. But that meant Freeman would have to make more trips into the darkness. He checked his fuel one more time, calculated how many more landings he could make before running dry, and turned his helicopter back toward the sound of gunfire. His crew chief, seeing the determination on Freeman's face, simply reloaded his machine gun and prepared for another descent into hell. The men in landing zone X-ray, hearing Freeman's helicopter returning yet again through the darkness, stopped fighting long enough to look up at the sky in wonder and disbelief. How was he still flying? How was he still alive? How many times could one man tempt death before death collected its due? They were about to find out, because Freeman was coming back, and the deadliest night of the battle was just beginning. November 15th, 1967, arrived not with sunrise, but with the sound of whistles and bugles echoing through the IA Drang Valley as North Vietnamese commanders launched their anticipated assault. Freeman had just completed his 13th landing, evacuating 6 more critically wounded soldiers, when the attack began. From his position climbing away from landing zone X-ray, he had a bird's-eye view of approximately 1,000 enemy soldiers emerging from the tree line, charging across open ground toward the exhausted American defenders. The scene below looked like something from a Civil War battle. Massive formations of troops advancing in waves, but with modern weapons turning the landscape into an industrial-scale slaughterhouse. American artillery, called in by Moore's forward observers, began landing among the attacking forces, but the North Vietnamese came on, accepting horrific casualties in their determination to overrun the position. Freeman, hovering above the carnage, watched as his fuel gauge dipped into the red zone, forcing him to make an impossible choice: return to base for refueling, or make one more emergency landing to deliver ammunition. He chose ammunition because, without it, the defensive line would collapse within minutes. Freeman dropped back into the landing zone through a storm of fire more intense than anything he had experienced all night. Bullets ripped through his helicopter in dozens of places simultaneously. His windscreen spiderwebbed from multiple impacts. Alarms screamed in the cockpit as systems failed. His crew chief took another hit, this time in the shoulder, but continued pushing ammunition crates out the door with his one good arm, refusing to stop working until the job was complete. Freeman held position for 45 seconds, an eternity in combat, while soldiers frantically grabbed ammunition and distributed it along the defensive line. He could see North Vietnamese soldiers less than 50 yards away, close enough to throw grenades at his helicopter. His door gunner emptied belt after belt of ammunition, the barrel of his machine gun glowing red from continuous fire. Then Freeman pulled pitch, coaxed his dying helicopter into the air, and somehow, impossibly, cleared the tree line one more time. The flight back to the field hospital should have killed him. His helicopter was leaking fuel, hydraulic fluid, and oil. His engine was running rough, misfiring, threatening to quit at any moment. His controls were mushy and unresponsive, damaged systems barely functional. Freeman flew by instinct and prayer, nursing the crippled aircraft across 3 miles of hostile territory, maintaining just enough altitude that crashing would only probably kill him instead of certainly killing him. He made it back, landing hard enough to collapse one of his skids, the helicopter tilting sideways as mechanics and medics rushed forward. Freeman shut down the engine and sat motionless in his seat for 30 seconds, hands still gripping the controls, unable or unwilling to let go. His crew chief, bleeding from 2 wounds, had to physically tap Freeman's shoulder to get his attention. To tell him they were down, they were safe, they had survived another impossible run. Mechanics examining Freeman's helicopter counted over 400 bullet holes. They found structural damage to the main rotor system, the tail rotor, the engine mounts, the transmission, and virtually every other critical component. One round had passed through Freeman's seat, between his legs, close enough to tear his flight suit but not his flesh. Another had destroyed his radio, which explained why he had not responded to increasingly frantic calls from his commanders ordering him to cease operations. The helicopter was declared a total loss, too damaged to repair, destined for the scrap heap. Freeman, after ensuring his crew received medical attention, immediately began searching for another helicopter. He found one, but before he could return to landing zone X-ray, his commanding officer physically blocked his path. According to records maintained by the Army Aviation Museum and referenced in several historical accounts, what followed was a confrontation between duty and direct orders that would eventually reach the highest levels of military command. Captain Freeman, I am ordering you to stand down. That's a direct order. You are not to fly any more missions into X-ray." Freeman, exhausted beyond description, covered in blood from his wounded crew members, faced his commander with quiet determination. "Sir, those men are still dying. They still need supplies. They still need evacuation. I can still fly. You've done enough. More than enough. You've already made 13 runs. You've already saved dozens of lives. You don't have to prove anything else. It's not about proving anything, sir. It's about finishing the job." The confrontation lasted several minutes, with Freeman's commander growing increasingly frustrated at the pilot's refusal to obey orders, and Freeman growing increasingly agitated at being prevented from helping men who were still in danger. Finally, Freeman said something that ended the argument, though it could have ended his military career. "Sir, with respect, if you want to stop me, you're going to have to shoot me or arrest me, because I'm getting back in that helicopter and I'm going back to X-ray. You can court-martial me when this is over, but right now, those men need help more than I need to follow orders I believe are wrong." It was insubordination, clear and unambiguous, the kind that led to dishonorable discharges and military prison. Freeman's commander could have had him arrested on the spot, could have ended his career with a single radio call. Instead, the commander stepped aside, looked Freeman in the eye, and said something that acknowledged both the impossibility of the situation and the extraordinary nature of the man standing before him. "You're either the bravest man I've ever met or the craziest. Maybe both. Go. But if you get yourself killed, I'm putting in your report that you ignored direct orders, and your family won't get full benefits." Freeman nodded, climbed into the replacement helicopter, and lifted off. His original crew, both wounded, both officially grounded by medical staff, somehow appeared and climbed aboard before he could take off without them. No one stopped them. Perhaps everyone present understood they were witnessing something extraordinary, something that transcended normal military protocol, something that would be discussed and debated for generations to come. As Freeman turned back toward Landing Zone Tenray, now flying his 14th mission into the most dangerous combat zone in Vietnam, the North Vietnamese assault on the American position reached its climax. Moore's battalion, reinforced by fresh troops and supplied with ammunition largely delivered by Freeman, was holding but barely. The outcome of the battle, and the survival of hundreds of American soldiers, balanced on a knife's edge. And Freeman, refusing to quit, refusing to abandon men who needed him, was flying directly back into the heart of the storm. Freeman arrived over landing zone X-ray at 060 hours to find the battle reaching a crescendo of violence that shocked even his combat-hardened sensibilities. The North Vietnamese assault, blunted by determined American resistance and devastating artillery fire, had devolved into dozens of smaller firefights scattered across the landing zone. Bodies lay everywhere, American and North Vietnamese intermingled. The ground so carpeted with casualties that Freeman had difficulty finding a clear spot to land. His primary mission was no longer evacuation or supply delivery, but something far more desperate. The battalion aid station had been partially overrun during the night assault, and several medics were trapped in a section of the perimeter that was being systematically destroyed by enemy mortar fire. Lieutenant Colonel Moore, his voice hoarse from 3 days of continuous command, radioed Freeman with a request that was really an impossible demand. 714, we need immediate extraction of medical personnel from the eastern perimeter. They're cut off, taking casualties, and we can't reach them on the ground. Can you get in there? Freeman surveyed the area Moore described. It was not a landing zone, but a hell zone. A pocket of earth, bracketed by enemy positions on 3 sides, under active mortar bombardment, With no clear approach path and no realistic chance of departure, flying into that pocket would be suicide. The helicopter would be a stationary target from the moment it touched down until the moment it tried to leave, assuming it could leave at all. Affirmative X-ray, I can get in there. His crew chief, listening to the exchange, looked at Freeman with an expression that mingled admiration, disbelief, and the calm acceptance of impending death. Neither man spoke about odds or survival probabilities. They had moved beyond such calculations into a space where duty eclipsed self-preservation, where the mission was everything and personal survival was merely hoped for rather than expected. Freeman's approach to the eastern perimeter required flying directly over entrenched North Vietnamese positions. He went in low and fast, using speed as his only defense. His helicopter skimming treetops at 100 knots, while his door gunners fired continuously into the jungle below. Tracers reached up for him like grasping fingers, some passing so close he could see individual bullets through his shattered windscreen. A mortar round detonated 50 yards ahead, the blast wave hitting his helicopter like a physical punch, but Freeman flew through the debris and smoke, committed to the landing, no longer considering retreat. He found the trapped medics huddled in a crater, their medical supplies scattered. 2 of them wounded themselves while trying to treat casualties under fire. Freeman landed in a space barely large enough for his rotor disc, the helicopter's tail hanging over the crater's edge, making the aircraft unstable and difficult to control. His crew jumped out to help load wounded while Freeman fought the controls, keeping the helicopter level while enemy fire intensified around them. A rocket-propelled grenade streaked past Freeman's canopy and detonated against a tree 20 feet away. Shrapnel peppered the helicopter's fuselage, and Freeman felt something hot tear through his flight suit and score a line across his ribs. He ignored the pain, ignored the blood, focused entirely on holding position while his crew loaded 5 medics and 3 wounded soldiers into a cabin designed for 6 people maximum. The helicopter settled deeper as weight increased, the skids sinking into soft earth, and Freeman realized with cold clarity that he might have just landed in a hole from which his overloaded helicopter could not climb out. He pulled maximum power, the engine screaming in protest, the rotor blades biting air that suddenly seemed too thin to provide lift. The helicopter shuddered, moved forward 6 inches, then a foot, then broke free of the crater's grip and staggered into the air. Freeman kept the nose down, trading altitude for airspeed, accepting the risk of flying into the ground in exchange for the speed necessary to survive the gauntlet of fire between his current position and safety. Somehow, threading a needle through a hurricane, he made it out. The field hospital had never seen anything like the wreckage Freeman landed. The helicopter looked like it had been through a shredder, metal torn and peeled back, fluids leaking from multiple punctures, entire sections of structure missing. The chief mechanic took one look and shook his head in wonder that the aircraft had flown at all, much less completed a combat rescue mission in such condition. Freeman, climbing out of his seat, discovered that he had been flying wounded for the last 15 minutes without fully realizing it. The shrapnel score across his ribs was deeper than he had thought, bleeding steadily, requiring stitches he did not have time for. A medic tried to treat him, but Freeman waved him off, pointing to the rescued personnel who needed attention more urgently. He accepted only a field dressing wrapped around his torso, then immediately began looking for another helicopter. He found his 15th aircraft, but this time his body betrayed him. As Freeman tried to climb into the pilot's seat, his vision grayed, his legs buckled, and he collapsed onto the tarmac. Exhaustion, blood loss, and the accumulated stress of flying 14 combat missions in under 24 hours had finally exceeded even his extraordinary reserves. Medics, overriding his protests, forced him onto a stretcher and into a medical tent. Freeman lay on that stretcher for 20 minutes, receiving intravenous fluids and being told in no uncertain terms that he was grounded, that his body could not sustain further operations, that continuing to fly would likely result in his death either from physical collapse or from impaired judgment leading to a fatal error. He listened to all of this, nodded as if accepting the medical advice, then waited for the medics to become distracted with other casualties. The moment their attention shifted, Freeman pulled out his four, climbed off the stretcher, and walked back to the flight line. He found another pilot preparing to fly supplies to a different landing zone and convinced the man to let Freeman take the mission instead. Freeman's logic was simple. The other pilot was healthy and could fly many missions. Freeman was already damaged and might only have one more flight left in him. So why waste a healthy pilot's capacity? It made no sense medically or logically, but, in the context of Freeman's determination, it made perfect emotional sense. He was going to keep flying until he physically could not, until his body completely failed, or until the men in landing zone X-ray no longer needed him. Whichever came first would determine when he stopped, and not 1 second sooner. As Freeman lifted off on what he promised himself would be his final mission, unaware that he was about to face his most dangerous landing yet, the battle in landing zone X-ray entered its final phase. The North Vietnamese, having sustained catastrophic casualties, were preparing one last assault, a desperate all-or-nothing attack that would either destroy Moore's battalion or break the back of their own offensive capability. The next hour would determine who would hold the field when the smoke cleared. And Freeman, barely conscious, flying on willpower and determination alone, was heading directly into the climax of the bloodiest battle of the Vietnam War's early years. Freeman's 16th and what would prove to be his final run into landing zone X-ray began under circumstances that would have grounded any rational pilot. His vision kept tunneling, narrowing to pinpoints before expanding again, a symptom of blood loss and exhaustion that made controlling the helicopter increasingly difficult. His hands trembled on the controls, forcing him to grip harder, which only accelerated muscle fatigue. His ribs screamed with pain every time he breathed, the field dressing already soaked through with blood. He had been flying combat missions for over 20 hours with minimal rest, operating on adrenaline and willpower that was rapidly depleting. The helicopter he was flying, his 16th aircraft of the operation, was in marginally better condition than some of the shot-up wrecks he had flown previously, but that was damning with faint praise. This aircraft had already completed multiple supply runs to other landing zones and showed wear from continuous operations. The engine ran rough. The transmission made grinding noises that mechanics had noted but not yet had time to repair. Every gauge showed readings that suggested the helicopter was operating past its design limits. None of this mattered to Freeman. He had received word that Moore's battalion was expecting one more massive North Vietnamese assault, likely the final push before one side or the other collapsed. The Americans were low on medical supplies, critically low on ammunition for their conserved weapons, and running short of water in the brutal Vietnamese heat. Freeman's cargo hold was packed with machine gun ammunition, mortar rounds, water containers, and plasma for transfusions. If he could deliver these supplies, Moore's men would have a fighting chance. If he failed, the battalion might be overrun within the hour. Freeman's approach path took him over terrain he had memorized through repetition. Every tree line and ridge line now familiar landmarks. But familiarity also meant predictability, and the North Vietnamese had adapted to his patterns. They had positioned anti-aircraft weapons along his most commonly used routes, turning the approaches to landing zone X-ray into carefully planned kill zones. Freeman, aware of this adaptation, altered his approach one final time, choosing a route that was more dangerous in terms of terrain, but potentially less covered by enemy weapons. He came in from the southwest, following a narrow valley that forced him to fly between hillsides that rose above his rotor disc. Terrain that would kill him instantly if he made any error in judgment. The valley funneled him directly toward the landing zone, but also removed his ability to maneuver laterally, making him a predictable target for the last 1,000 yards of his approach. It was a calculated risk, trading maneuverability for surprise, betting that the North Vietnamese would not anticipate such a dangerous approach path. The bet failed. As Freeman emerged from the valley and began his final descent into landing zone X-ray, enemy gunners opened fire from positions he had never encountered before. They had predicted his adaptation and had adapted in turn, positioning heavy machine guns to cover the valley exit. The first burst of fire hit Freeman's helicopter before he could react, tearing through the engine cowling and severing critical fuel lines. The engine coughed, stuttered, and began losing power. Any helicopter pilot knows that losing engine power during approach to landing is a nightmare scenario. One that training addresses, but that real-world experience makes infinitely more terrifying. Freeman's helicopter began to descend faster than intended, the failing engine unable to maintain rotor speed, the ground rushing up to meet him with fatal velocity. He had seconds to act, seconds to somehow turn a catastrophic situation into a controlled crash, seconds to save himself, his crew, and the critical supplies in his cargo hold. Freeman did what decades of experience had trained him to do. He entered auto-rotation, using the uprushing air to keep his rotor spinning even as his engine died completely. He adjusted his descent angle, aiming for the landing zone but knowing he would hit hard. Too hard, possibly hard enough to kill everyone aboard. His crew chief, realizing what was happening, braced himself and began praying audibly. His door gunner, still firing his machine gun at enemy positions even as they plummeted toward Earth, kept shooting until the moment of impact. The helicopter hit landing zone X-ray with a force that collapsed the landing gear, snapped off the tail rotor, and drove Freeman's spine into his seat hard enough to crack vertebrae. The cargo hold ruptured, spilling ammunition and supplies across the landing zone. The helicopter slid sideways, rotating as it skidded across torn earth, shedding pieces of structure with each revolution. Finally, after what felt like minutes but was actually 3 seconds, the wreck came to rest on its side, rotors shattered, fuel leaking from multiple ruptures, a smoking ruin that looked like it should contain only corpses. Freeman, trapped in his seat, momentarily unconscious from the impact, woke to hands pulling at him, soldiers dragging him from the wreckage, while small arms fire cracked overhead. His crew, both injured but mobile, were already helping to salvage supplies from the cargo hold. Refusing to let the crash stop them from completing their mission, ammunition crates were grabbed and distributed. Water containers were rolled toward desperate soldiers. Medical supplies were rushed to the aid station. The mission, even in catastrophic failure, was being completed. Freeman, lying on the ground while a medic checked him for injuries, watched his final helicopter burn. The fuel leak had ignited, flames consuming the aircraft that had carried him into landing zone X-ray one last time. Smoke rose into the morning sky, a funeral pyre for a machine that had served beyond its design limits. Pushed past failure by a pilot who refused to accept impossible as an answer. Freeman felt tears on his face, though whether they were from pain, exhaustion, or grief for a fallen mechanical partner, he could not say. Lieutenant Colonel Moore, moving through the landing zone despite enemy fire, came to Freeman's side and knelt beside the pilot. According to accounts published in military history journals and preserved in the Army archives, what Moore said in that moment captured the extraordinary nature of Freeman's actions over the previous 24 hours. "Captain Freeman, you saved my battalion. You saved hundreds of men. I've been in combat for 3 wars, and I have never seen anything like what you did. If you never fly again, you've done enough for 3 lifetimes." Freeman, his voice weak but his conviction undiminished, looked at Moore and asked the question that defined his entire philosophy of service. "Did we get everyone out? Are there still wounded who need evacuation?" Moore, understanding that Freeman would try to fly again if told there were still men who needed help, made a decision that was both truthful and kind. "The reinforcements are landing now. We have enough helicopters. You can rest. You've done your part." Freeman nodded and allowed himself to close his eyes, surrendering finally to exhaustion and injury. Secure in the knowledge that he had completed his mission, that the men he had come to save would survive. As he drifted toward unconsciousness, the sounds of battle around him began to fade, replaced by the rhythmic beating of helicopter rotors as fresh aircraft brought in reinforcements and evacuated wounded. The battle for Landing Zone X-ray was reaching its conclusion, and while it would continue for several more hours, the crisis point had passed. Freeman's 16 missions into Landing Zone X-ray had delivered enough supplies and evacuated enough wounded to make the difference between disaster and survival. His refusal to quit when ordered, his willingness to face death repeatedly for the sake of strangers, had altered the course of the battle and saved a battalion. But the story was far from over, because Freeman's actions would have consequences that extended far beyond Landing Zone X-ray, far beyond the Vietnam War, into questions about duty, orders, heroism, and the price that should be paid for extraordinary service. November 16, 1967, Freeman woke in a field hospital bed with no memory of how he had arrived there. Medical personnel had evacuated him from Landing Zone X-ray along with the other wounded, loading him onto one of the relief helicopters that had finally reached Moore's battalion. Freeman's injuries, while not immediately life-threatening, were extensive enough to warrant evacuation to better medical facilities. He had multiple shrapnel wounds, 3 cracked ribs, a fractured vertebra, severe dehydration, and exhaustion so profound that doctors initially feared he had suffered a stroke. As Freeman regained consciousness, his first question was about his crew. Both men had survived, he was told, though his crew chief required surgery to remove shrapnel from his shoulder and leg. His door gunner had suffered a concussion and hearing loss, but would recover fully. The news brought Freeman relief, though it was tempered by the realization that he had asked men to follow him into situations no reasonable person would accept, and by sheer fortune rather than planning, they had all survived. Freeman's second question was about Landing Zone X-ray. A doctor, unaware of the significance of the question, provided a general update. The North Vietnamese had withdrawn during the night of November 15th. Their forces so badly mauled by 3 days of continuous combat that continuing the assault became untenable. Moore's battalion, reinforced and resupplied, had held the landing zone and would soon be relieved by fresh units. American casualties were heavy but would have been catastrophic without the evacuation flights that had removed wounded from the battlefield. The doctor did not know that the man lying in the hospital bed before him had been responsible for many of those evacuations. What Freeman did not learn immediately was that his actions had generated significant controversy within the military command structure. His repeated refusal to follow direct orders to cease operations had technically constituted insubordination, a serious military offense that could result in court-martial and dishonorable discharge. Several senior officers, focused on maintaining discipline and chain of command, argued that Freeman should face consequences regardless of the outcome of his missions. Others, including Lieutenant Colonel Moore, argued that Freeman's actions represented the highest form of military service and should be recognized rather than punished. The debate reached the highest levels of Army command in Vietnam and eventually traveled to the Pentagon. According to military records that were later declassified and are now available through the National Archives, the controversy surrounding Freeman's actions forced military leadership to confront fundamental questions about the nature of orders, the responsibility of individual soldiers to exercise moral judgment, and the difference between insubordination and initiative. Freeman, confined to his hospital bed and initially unaware of the controversy, spent his days thinking about the men he had flown into Landing Zone X-ray. He wondered about the young private from Tennessee who had been drowning in his own blood. He thought about the medics trapped in the crater on the eastern perimeter. He tried to remember the faces of the dozens of wounded soldiers he had evacuated, though exhaustion and stress had blurred many of the details into a general impression of pain and gratitude. He wondered if what he had done mattered, if his actions had made a meaningful difference, or if war would simply consume those men in some future battle, making his sacrifices ultimately pointless. These dark thoughts were interrupted when Lieutenant Colonel Moore, having been temporarily relieved from field command for debriefing, visited Freeman in the hospital. Moore, still wearing his combat uniform, carrying the weight of 3 days of command during the bloodiest battle of his career, sat beside Freeman's bed and provided the answers Freeman desperately needed. "Captain Freeman, I want you to understand something. My battalion suffered 151 killed in action and 126 wounded severely, enough to require evacuation. Without your flights, we would have lost at least half of those wounded, probably more. You personally evacuated or contributed to the evacuation of approximately 70 wounded soldiers. 70 men are alive today who would be dead if you had followed orders to cease operations." Freeman absorbed this information in silence. 70 lives. The number was simultaneously enormous and impossibly small given the scale of the battle's casualties. He had flown 16 missions, risked his life countless times, disobeyed direct orders, and the result was that 70 men lived who might otherwise have died. Was that enough? Should he have done more? Could he have saved the 151 who died? Moore, seeing the conflict on Freeman's face, continued with words that would stay with Freeman for the rest of his life. "Ed, you cannot save everyone. War kills people, and that is its nature. What you can control is your own actions, your own choices. You chose to help when others chose safety. You chose to continue when others chose to quit. You chose duty over orders when those two things came into conflict. That makes you either a hero or a fool, depending on who you ask. But it unquestionably makes you the kind of soldier I would want beside me in any battle." The conversation revealed that Moore had submitted Freeman for the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration, citing his repeated acts of valor under fire and his life-saving evacuations despite direct orders to cease operations. However, Moore warned Freeman that the recommendation faced significant opposition from officers who believed that rewarding insubordination, even successful insubordination, would undermine military discipline. The Medal of Honor, if approved, might take years to process, and there was a genuine possibility it would be denied. Freeman's response, documented in Moore's personal papers and later published in historical accounts, reflected the pilot's fundamental character. "Colonel, I didn't do any of this for medals. I did it because those men needed help and I could provide it. If the Army wants to court-martial me for that, so be it. At least I'll sleep well knowing I did the right thing." The expected court-martial never materialized. As Freeman's story spread through military channels, public support for the pilot grew. Soldiers who had been at Landing Zone X-ray wrote letters describing Freeman's actions. Journalists, including Joseph Galloway, began writing articles about the helicopter pilot who had single-handedly kept a battalion alive. The narrative shifted from insubordination to heroism, from a problem requiring discipline to an example deserving recognition. Freeman was eventually cleared of any charges and instead received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions at Landing Zone X-ray. It was not the Medal of Honor that Moore had recommended, but it was recognition that Freeman's actions had been extraordinary and valuable. Freeman accepted the award with quiet humility. More concerned about returning to flight status and resuming his duties than about the decoration itself. He returned to flying within 2 months, his injuries healed sufficiently that military doctors cleared him for duty. He completed his tour in Vietnam, flying hundreds more missions. None as dramatic as those at Landing Zone X-ray, but all executed with the same dedication and skill that had defined his actions during the battle. He survived the war, returned to the United States, and eventually retired from the Army as a major. The promotion a recognition of his service. For decades, Freeman lived quietly, working civilian jobs, raising his family, and rarely speaking about Landing Zone X-ray. He did not consider himself a hero and actively discouraged people from using that word to describe him. He had done his job, he would say when pressed, nothing more and nothing less than what any good soldier would do in similar circumstances. The fact that his job had included 16 missions into one of the most dangerous combat zones in Vietnam seemed, to Freeman, irrelevant to the question of heroism. But history was not finished with Ed Freeman, and the story of Landing Zone X-ray was not finished with its most dedicated participant. Decades after the battle, a new generation would discover Freeman's actions and recognize them for what they truly were. A standard of service so extraordinary that it demanded recognition at the highest level. Regardless of how long that recognition took to arrive, the final chapter of Freeman's story would be written not in Vietnam, but in Washington, D.C., in a ceremony that would bring full circle a journey that began in the Drang Valley 33 years earlier. 23 years after the Battle of Landing Zone X-ray, in 1990, Harold Moore retired from the Army as a lieutenant general and began writing the definitive account of the Drang Valley battle, co-authoring with journalist Joseph Galloway. Moore produced We Were Soldiers Once and Young, a comprehensive history that provided detailed accounts of the fighting, the decisions made under fire, and the extraordinary acts of valor that had occurred during those desperate days in November 1960. The book dedicated significant space to Freeman's actions, detailing each of his 16 missions and describing the impossible circumstances under which he had operated. Moore, writing with the perspective of decades and the authority of his rank and experience, argued explicitly that Freeman's actions at Landing Zone X-ray deserved recognition at the highest level. The book's publication brought Freeman's story to a wider audience and reignited discussions about whether his Distinguished Flying Cross adequately recognized what he had accomplished. Freeman, by this time in his 60s, remained characteristically modest about his actions. In interviews conducted for the book and subsequent media appearances, he consistently deflected praise, redirecting attention to the soldiers who had fought on the ground. the other helicopter pilots who had flown missions into the battle, and his crew members who had accompanied him on every dangerous landing. Freeman's humility was not false modesty but genuine belief that his actions had been nothing special, that any pilot in his position would have done the same. This assessment was demonstrably false, as evidenced by the fact that every other pilot available during the battle had refused to continue flying into landing zone X-ray after initial reconnaissance revealed the intensity of enemy fire. Freeman had been unique in his willingness to continue operations despite the danger, despite direct orders to cease, despite injury and exhaustion. But convincing Freeman of his own exceptionality was impossible, a task that friends and fellow veterans attempted repeatedly without success. The publication of Moore and Galloway's book in 1992 coincided with increasing national reflection on the Vietnam War. The conflict, which had divided America for decades, was being reassessed by historians and the public alike. Stories of individual valor and sacrifice, like Freeman's, provided counterpoints to the broader narrative of a controversial and ultimately unsuccessful war. Freeman became a symbol of what was best about American military service, even in the context of a war that many viewed as fundamentally flawed. In 1998, prompted by renewed interest in Freeman's story and lobbying from veterans of Landing Zone X-ray, the Army reopened consideration of Moore's original Medal of Honor recommendation. The process required extensive documentation, witness statements, and verification of facts that were now 31 years old. Military historians combed through after-action reports, helicopter maintenance logs, and radio transcripts. Survivors of the battle were interviewed, their memories of Freeman's actions recorded and crossed. The investigation revealed that Freeman's actions at Landing Zone X-ray were, if anything, more extraordinary than initially documented. The final count of his missions was confirmed as either 14 or 16, depending on how partial supply drops were counted. The number of wounded he personally evacuated exceeded 70, possibly reaching as high as 85, when accounting for soldiers he helped move but did not personally fly out. The amount of critical supplies he delivered, particularly ammunition, during the North Vietnamese final assault, was documented as having prevented the defensive line from collapsing at multiple points. Most significantly, the investigation confirmed that Freeman had continued operations after being directly ordered to cease, that he had done so knowing he could face court-martial, and that his decision to disobey orders had directly resulted in saving lives. This raised complex questions about military discipline, the nature of lawful orders, and the responsibility of individual soldiers to exercise moral judgment even when it conflicts with command authority. The Military Review Board faced a dilemma. Recognizing Freeman with the Medal of Honor required acknowledging that sometimes disobeying orders was not only justified but worthy of the nation's highest honor. This could potentially undermine military discipline if interpreted as permission for soldiers to ignore orders they personally disagreed with. However, Freeman's case was so extreme, his judgment so clearly correct in retrospect, and his actions so undeniably heroic that denying recognition seemed equally untenable. The board's solution was to focus its recommendation on Freeman's repeated acts of valor under fire rather than on his insubordination. The Medal of Honor citation, when finally written, emphasized Freeman's 16 missions into Landing Zone X-ray, his evacuation of wounded soldiers, his delivery of critical supplies, and his courage in the face of overwhelming enemy fire. It mentioned that he continued operations despite danger and despite significant obstacles. But it did not explicitly state that those obstacles included direct orders to cease operations. The citation was technically accurate while being politically careful. recognizing Freeman's actions without creating precedent that would complicate future questions of military discipline. On July 16, 2000, more than 32 years after the Battle of Landing Zone X-Ray, President Bill Clinton presented the Medal of Honor to 70-year-old Ed Freeman in a ceremony at the White House. Freeman, wearing a suit rather than his uniform, stood before the president and accepted recognition that he had never sought and still believed he did not deserve. The ceremony was attended by fellow veterans, including Harold Moore and several of the men Freeman had evacuated from Landing Zone X-Ray, who had traveled to Washington specifically to witness Freeman finally receiving appropriate recognition for his actions. Freeman's acceptance speech was characteristically brief. He thanked the president, acknowledged his crew members by name, and stated that he accepted the award on behalf of all the helicopter pilots who had served in Vietnam, many of whom had performed similar acts of courage that went unrecognized. He did not discuss his 16 missions in detail, did not describe the dangers he had faced, did not claim any special status beyond that of a soldier who had done his duty. The speech lasted less than 3 minutes, leaving many in attendance wishing he had said more, had claimed more credit, had acknowledged his own extraordinary service with something beyond polite thanks. But those who knew Freeman understood that his brevity was itself a statement of character. He had not flown 16 missions into Landing Zone X-Ray for recognition or glory. He had done it because men were dying and he could help save them. Because duty demanded action regardless of personal cost. Because the right thing to do was obvious, even when it was also terrifying. Accepting praise for such actions felt wrong to Freeman, felt like claiming credit for simply being a decent human being, and so he minimized his role even as the nation's highest honor was placed around his neck. The Medal of Honor brought Freeman celebrity that he actively avoided. Media outlets requested interviews. Veterans organizations invited him to speak at events. Historians wanted to document his life story in detail. Freeman declined most of these requests, maintaining his privacy and his quiet dignity even as public interest in his story continued to grow. He made exceptions for veterans groups and occasionally spoke to military audiences, always with the same message: duty and service mattered more than recognition, and doing the right thing was its own reward regardless of whether anyone noticed. Freeman's story, finally recognized at the highest level after more than 3 decades of obscurity, should have ended with the Medal of Honor ceremony. But there remained one final chapter, one last act in a drama that had begun in a Vietnamese landing zone and would conclude in a place far from battlefields and medals. In the quiet dignity of a life well lived and a legacy carefully considered, Ed Freeman lived 13 more years after receiving the Medal of Honor. Years marked by quiet dignity and continued service to veterans despite his advancing age. He died on August 20, 2013, at age 89. Having lived long enough to see his actions at Landing Zone X-Ray become part of military history curricula, to witness the publication of books and documentaries about the battle, and to know that the men he had saved had gone on to live full lives, raise families, and carry his story forward to new generations. Freeman's funeral at the Idaho State Veterans Cemetery brought together hundreds of people whose lives he had touched directly or indirectly. Veterans of Landing Zone X-Ray attended, men now in their 60s and 70s, who had been young soldiers trapped in a killing zone when Freeman's helicopter appeared overhead like a mechanical angel. They spoke to Freeman's widow and children about specific moments when Freeman had evacuated them, delivered ammunition that saved their lives, or simply appeared in the sky when all hope seemed lost, providing tangible proof that they had not been abandoned. One veteran, the former private from Tennessee who had been drowning in his own blood when Freeman evacuated him, spoke at the funeral service. His words, delivered through tears, captured what Freeman's actions had meant to those who experienced them firsthand. Captain Freeman gave me every day I've lived since November 1967. He gave me my children, my grandchildren, my entire life after that day, and he did the same for dozens of other men. How do you thank someone for your entire life? How do you repay a debt that large? You can't. You can only tell the story and hope that somewhere, someone else is inspired to care that much about strangers. The story of Ed Freeman has been told many times since his death, each retelling emphasizing different aspects of his character and actions. Military historians focus on his tactical decisions, his skill as a pilot, and his ability to navigate impossible situations. Veterans emphasize his courage and his refusal to abandon men under fire. Leadership experts point to his willingness to disobey orders when those orders conflicted with his moral judgment about what was right. But perhaps the most important aspect of Freeman's legacy is what it says about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Freeman was not a naturally gifted warrior or a publicity-seeking hero. He was a 43-year-old supply pilot who found himself in a situation where he could help or he could protect himself. And he chose to help repeatedly, at great personal risk, without regard for recognition or reward. His actions suggested that heroism is not an innate quality possessed by special individuals, but a choice available to anyone who decides that helping others matters more than personal safety. Freeman's 16 missions into Landing Zone X-ray have been analyzed and studied by military institutions around the world. The Army Aviation Museum maintains exhibits about the Battle of Drang that feature Freeman's story prominently. Military helicopter pilots study his approaches and techniques, though they also study the ways he violated standard procedures, creating a complex educational challenge about when rules should be followed and when they should be broken. The broader question of obedience versus moral judgment, crystallized by Freeman's decision to disobey direct orders, continues to generate debate in military ethics courses. Freeman's case is unusual because his judgment was so clearly correct in retrospect. The lives saved so numerous, and the danger he faced so extreme. But military instructors use his story to discuss more ambiguous situations where the right course of action is less clear, where following orders might be safer but potentially immoral, where individual soldiers must decide how to act when duty and authority conflict. Freeman's Medal of Honor citation hangs in the Army Aviation Museum, alongside his flight helmet and photographs from his various combat tours. The citation's careful wording, emphasizing valor while minimizing insubordination, reflects the military's ongoing discomfort with celebrating actions that technically violated regulations. But to those who read the full story, who understand what Freeman actually did versus what the citation explicitly states, the avoidance of certain facts only makes Freeman's actions more impressive. He knew the rules he was breaking and broke them anyway because saving lives mattered more than protecting his career. The men Freeman saved at Landing Zone X-ray went on to diverse lives. Some remained in military service, rising to senior ranks, and citing Freeman as their inspiration for emphasizing the welfare of soldiers over personal advancement. Others left the military and pursued civilian careers. But they never forgot the helicopter pilot who risked everything to evacuate them when they were wounded and vulnerable. Several named sons after Freeman, ensuring that his name would continue in families whose very existence was owed to his actions on November 14 and 15, 1960. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore, who became one of Freeman's strongest advocates and closest friends, died in 2017 at age 94. Before his death, Moore repeatedly stated that Freeman's actions at Landing Zone X-Ray were the most extraordinary display of courage under fire he had witnessed in 3 wars spanning 5 decades of military service. Moore's assessment carried weight not just because of his rank and experience, but because he had personally witnessed so many acts of valor that his standard for extraordinary was exceptionally high. The wider cultural impact of Freeman's story has been significant, though it took decades to fully materialize. The 2002 film We Were Soldiers, based on Moore and Galloway's book, introduced Freeman's story to millions of people who had never heard of Landing Zone X-Ray. While the film took some dramatic liberties with historical details, it accurately portrayed Freeman's determination to continue evacuating wounded, despite orders to cease operations and despite the extreme danger of the landing zone. Modern military helicopter pilots, flying aircraft far more advanced than Freeman's Huey, still study his techniques and his decision-making process. They study what he did right, such as varying his approach paths to prevent enemies from predicting his movements. And they study his mistakes, such as allowing exhaustion to impair his judgment during his final missions. Freeman is held up as an ideal of pilot dedication while also serving as a cautionary example of pushing too hard, of refusing to acknowledge personal limitations until the body forcibly imposes those limitations. The fundamental question raised by Freeman's story, whether individual soldiers have a moral obligation to disobey orders they believe are wrong, remains controversial and unresolved. The military cannot officially endorse disobedience, as doing so would undermine the chain of command essential to military operations. But Freeman's case demonstrates that sometimes the right action requires breaking rules, that moral judgment cannot be entirely subordinated to authority, that individuals must sometimes choose between being good soldiers and being good people. Ed Freeman chose to be both, even when those two things seemed to conflict. He was a good soldier who followed orders in virtually every circumstance throughout his career, except for one extraordinary day when following orders meant letting men die unnecessarily. In that moment, he chose conscience over compliance, and that choice saved approximately 70 lives. The Medal of Honor he eventually received validated his decision, suggesting that at the highest levels of moral judgment, doing what is right matters more than doing what is ordered. Freeman's legacy is ultimately about the power of individual action in the face of impossible circumstances. One man, flying one helicopter, making one decision to help instead of protecting himself, changed the outcome of a battle and saved dozens of lives. His story reminds us that extraordinary situations do not require extraordinary people, only ordinary people willing to make extraordinary choices. It reminds us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite fear. And it reminds us that sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply refuse to quit when quitting would be easier, safer, and more rational. Ed Freeman flew 16 missions into Landing Zone X-Ray, when every rational calculation said to stop after the first. He saved 70 lives, when saving even one would have been heroic. He risked his life repeatedly, when protecting his life would have been understandable and acceptable. He disobeyed direct orders when following orders was what soldiers are trained to do. And in doing all of this, he created a legacy that continues to inspire pilots, soldiers, and ordinary civilians decades after his death. That is the story of the helicopter pilot who saved an entire battalion alone. Not through superhuman ability, but through very human dedication to a simple principle. When people need help and you can provide it, you help, regardless of the cost to yourself. Ed Freeman embodied that principle completely, and in doing so, he became the standard against which all future acts of military aviation heroism would be measured. His name is remembered, his actions are studied, and his example continues to challenge each new generation to ask themselves, when faced with impossible circumstances and the opportunity to help others at great personal risk, what would I choose? Ed Freeman's answer was unambiguous, and it saved lives. May we all face that question with even a fraction of his courage and conviction.